EarthBound, perhaps one of the most well-known legendary RPGs in the history of video games. A game that tossed aside genre norms, a game that would go on to influence countless iconic titles from indie developers decades down the road. A game often considered to simply be one of the best games of all time. So how come nobody bought it? EarthBound's commercial failure in the US has been chalked up to a few different things over the years. Reasons I've seen include Nintendo not marketing the game enough, or perhaps they marketed it plenty but they just didn't do a good job. Maybe it was an inflated MSRP brought about by the bundled strategy guide included with every copy. Maybe the Western audience wasn't ready for RPGs. Maybe the game looked too childish, or maybe the writing was too adult. Maybe the Midwestern America-inspired setting didn't resonate with the same magic to actual Americans as it had to the original Japanese audience. Maybe it actually did great, but Nintendo of America just didn't make enough copies to satisfy the secretly high demand. Probably not that last one. I'm John Rairdin for the Video Game History Foundation, and today let's take a trip into the Video Game History Foundation's digital library and dig up some contemporary takes on EarthBound. How did Nintendo of America present it? How did audiences react? Join me and let's put EarthBound in context. Before Mother 2 had ever made it to Western shores as EarthBound, that title was already floating around in the periphery of the Nintendo fandom in North America. At one point, EarthBound was planned to be the title for an English localization of the original Mother. Ultimately, that game wouldn't make it out of Japan until 2015, when it released on the Wii U Virtual Console. In the January 1994 issue of Nintendo Power, a segment called Only in Japan highlighted a variety of NES titles that never made it out of Japan. One of these games is Mother. The majority of the write-up focuses on how popular RPGs are in Japan and how their sales in the US just don't come close. The article concludes with, "Plans to release Mother here, under the name EarthBound, were put on hold. Super Mother, the eagerly awaited sequel, is coming soon to the Super Famicom in Japan. Only time will tell whether we'll ever see a version of Mother here in the States." Several of the write-ups in this section also highlight sales numbers for the games in question, which I find extremely interesting. There is a comment at the end of the Mother segment pointing out that it didn't sell as well as Final Fantasy or Dragon Warrior, or Dragon Quest, but that it was still very popular. They cite Mother as having sold about 150,000 units. Both the Final Fantasy series and Dragon Warrior series are also highlighted as having games that never made it out of Japan, but they don't give us sales numbers for those. Still, we can pull some key information from this. It gives us a clear view of the general interest in RPGs in the US versus Japan in 1994. Keep in mind this article is a retrospective, and we're well into the Super Nintendo by this point. It also lets us know that Mother, while popular, was not on the same level in terms of sales as the big RPG franchises of that time. The following year, Mother 2 would resurface at Winter CES in Las Vegas, now sporting the EarthBound name. From here, Nintendo's efforts to sell EarthBound in the US would move into full swing. Meanwhile, press coverage would pretty quickly begin highlighting the hurdles that Nintendo of America was about to face. At this time, the RPG genre was dominated by swords and sorcery. It makes sense. A genre derived from attempts to bring the experience of Dungeons & Dragons into a digital space naturally comes with its fair share of dungeons and/or dragons. EarthBound was very much not that. It was a game inspired by Middle America. For Japan, it was sort of a romanticized version of another culture, but now you're selling it to the culture it's a romanticized version of. Nintendo of America rightly realized that some of that allure would be lost selling it to Americans. So their initial marketing move was to just sort of lean into the fact that it was weird. In the March 1995 issue of Nintendo Power, they published a pretty massive 5-page preview formatted as a satirical news report. In a move that's sure to offend millions of game players, Nintendo has thrown out the book on RPGs and replaced fantasy with reality and dozens of other cheap ploys and weird innovations. The writing is honestly pretty solid, and in my opinion, this preview does a really good job of conveying a lot of the absurdity and style of EarthBound's writing. I found myself really enjoying this preview, but as I got to the end of it and glimpsed the next article, something hit me. You go from the intentionally simple visuals of EarthBound right into a gorgeous screenshot of Final Fantasy III. That's Final Fantasy VI if you're using the actual real numbering system, not the weird 90s. It's complicated, that's a different video. But this shot shows a detailed airship flying over a pseudo 3D landscape presented via the Super Nintendo's iconic Mode 7 display mode. So if you're part of this niche audience in the United States playing console RPGs in the early to mid 90s, which of these games are you gonna play? Because I know which one I'd pick. This is a problem that would plague EarthBound in the lead up to launch. Superplay magazine number 29 said that the graphics are eye-openingly unimpressive. The April 1995 edition of Electronic Games said that it doesn't have graphics as good as comparable products. While EarthBound's graphics are obviously an intentional art design choice, it is easy to see what press we're talking about. Put EarthBound up against something like Chrono Trigger, which came out in March of that year. Not to mention, EarthBound was a first-party Nintendo game. Donkey Kong Country had just released the previous fall, Star Fox was a couple years old, and at the time, its sequel was expected to release that summer alongside EarthBound. In fact, multiple 3D Super FX titles like Star Fox 2 were displayed right next to EarthBound at that CES showing. We were far enough into the Super Nintendo's life that players were expecting top-notch visuals from first-party software, and EarthBound was having a really hard time making a case for itself in that department. As EarthBound got closer to launch, Nintendo Power outlined plans to launch EarthBound with a bundled strategy guide that included some scratch and sniff segments to allow you to smell the monsters. The goal here being to help players less familiar with RPGs not to get stuck. The scratch and sniff played into a larger marketing push built on gross-out concepts that were extremely prevalent in the mid-1990s.
Makes lots of gross things, and then you eat them.
Super Stinkers water gun. We got a Super Stinkers water gun, and we're gonna have some smelly fun. Super pepperoni pizza. Super Stinkers.
A $10 coupon bundled with the various magazines that were running ads for the game proudly proclaimed, "This game stinks." I've seen a lot of modern commentary on this campaign being a key factor in EarthBound's poor sales, but this is a great example of why historical context is so important. This style of advertising was extremely popular at the time. It was popular because it worked. It's eye-catching, it comes with a coupon for the game, and the scratch and sniff made it extremely memorable. Not only is this marketing not bad, in my opinion, it's pretty darn good. It plays into the trending style of the time while still managing to stand out. That coupon is also worth talking about for a moment, as one of the other frequently cited reasons for EarthBound's poor sales was that it was too expensive. The generally repeated claim is that the inclusion of the strategy guide inflated the price, which is often reported to have been around $90 to $100. This struck me as odd, as the guide is always referred to as being free.
Now get the EarthBound Player's Guide free with your purchase of the Super NES EarthBound Game Pack.
So I can't imagine that people wouldn't have noticed that it, wasn't. I also knew that standardized pricing for games didn't really exist in 1995, and every retailer was setting their own price and either trying to undercut their competitors or squeeze a few extra bucks out of a game. So I did some digging. The origin of this claim seems to be from this advertisement, which lists EarthBound as costing $89.98. But when I looked elsewhere for the contemporary pricing, I was getting numbers closer to $60 to $65. Well, as it turns out, that $89.98 price is in Canadian dollars. And if we pull up the exchange rate from 1995 and do the math, that comes out to about, wouldn't you know, $65 US. If we stack that up against other Super Nintendo games from 1995, we can see that EarthBound is largely in line with other RPGs of the era. So no, EarthBound was not especially expensive. At least not officially. Your individual retailer experience may have varied. Once again, this was 1995. Still, it's safe to say that neither the game's marketing nor its pricing were likely to have had a significant negative effect on its perception at the time. EarthBound released to what I would say were overall positive reviews. As our founder Frank Cifaldi pointed out in a 2016 Tumblr post, aggregating EarthBound's review scores would put it at around a 72%. Probably not Game of the Year, but not bad. EGM praised the writing, saying, "Some of our editors are saying that the storyline is better than Final Fantasy III's," and highlighting the humor in particular. Game Players wasn't quite as positive on the writing, but did say that it and the humor was perfect for a younger audience with its quick pacing, ultimately giving the game a 69 out of 100. GameFan called it the most hilarious video game ever released in English, and another reviewer in that same publication said that it has one of the most coherent, sophisticated, and funny storylines in any RPG. The magazine's Viewpoint review, which is a collection of 3 smaller reviews, awarded EarthBound an 85, a 90, and a 92. The negative aspect that critics more or less universally agreed on was that EarthBound was ugly, echoing a lot of the sentiment that we saw in the earlier previews. EGM called the graphics cheesy. Game Players said they were barely better than 8-bit. They're infantile, according to Video Games Magazine, and made the author want to gag. Fruity, cheesy, dinky, those were all words that GameFan used to describe the graphics. GamePro's reviewer actually seems to have confused EarthBound for a port of Mother rather than Mother 2, because it kinda looks like an NES game. At best, reviewers found the visuals childish, and at worst, felt they were a generation behind. And they weren't entirely wrong. EarthBound was designed to be a nostalgic throwback to NES-era RPGs that the Japanese audience would have fond memories of. But here, in the United States, Nintendo had to literally give away copies of Dragon Warrior. So a lot of EarthBound's appeal was based on a nostalgia that the US audience in 1995 didn't have. To reiterate a point I made earlier about the time period in which EarthBound released, the Saturn and PlayStation had already released in Japan. Some of these reviewers very likely had imported PlayStations sitting on the desk next to them while playing EarthBound. Looking back on it now that this art style has grown a bit more appealing, it can be hard to understand their perspective, but imagine you're reviewing EarthBound, while at the same time working your way through an imported copy of Kingsfield. EarthBound doesn't just look old, it looks ancient. The same magazines reviewing EarthBound are showing off the Nintendo 64. Removed from the context of being more or less a Dragon Quest parody, EarthBound lost a lot of its appeal for contemporary audiences in the US. The fascinating thing about EarthBound to me is not that it failed. I think its failure was more or less inevitable. And I don't mean because there was really anything wrong with the game itself, but simply that the context of its release meant the odds were absolutely stacked against it. And no amount of marketing from NOA was going to change that. No, what fascinates me about EarthBound is that NOA released it at all. Because anybody looking at the data almost assuredly told them, hey, that won't work. I mean, it's not a particularly hard equation to solve. But Minoru Arakawa, the president of Nintendo of America, had a seemingly endless confidence that RPGs could work in the US. And in fairness to him, they eventually did. It's why NOA published Dragon Warrior and Final Fantasy on the NES. EarthBound, as an internally developed game, didn't require additional licensing fees and was therefore a comparatively cheap localization versus something from Square or Enix. And ultimately, the fact that EarthBound wasn't expensive to produce, the fact that it was a very basic cartridge, was very likely the reason why it survived, while games like Star Fox 2, Comanche, and FX Fighter didn't. In other words, all the games it was demoed alongside at CES. All of this comes together to create a perfect example of why we can learn so much from putting history in context. But that's all I've got for today. I do have some questions for you though. If you're someone who's old enough to remember when EarthBound came out, did you get it at launch? Do you remember seeing the advertisements and having positive or negative feelings about it? What did you think about the graphics at the time? And same deal if you didn't buy it, why not? For everyone else, I'd love to know if there are other games like EarthBound where you think it would be interesting to dig into the context around it. Let me know in the comments, or if you're in the Video Game History Foundation's Patreon Discord, just tag me in there. I'm lurking in the shadows. Or you can reach out to me on your social media platform of choice using the handles on screen. As always, thank you for supporting the Video Game History Foundation. You can learn more and donate to help us continue this work by visiting gamehistory.org/donate. And if you'd like to get access to all the resources that I used for this video, they're available for free on our archive at archive.gamehistory.org. You don't have to wait for us to research something, you can just do it yourself. Once again, my name's John Rairdin. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.